Now, I recently bought the cheapest AMD mini PC that I've ever seen on Amazon, and what I ended up getting was pretty surprising. The box came with a crap load of accessories. We got a Bluetooth adapter, we got a mouse, a Wi-Fi adapter, and it even came with a DisplayPort to HDMI adapter. And of course, we also got a keyboard to go along with the mouse. Now, nothing in these accessories is surprisingly high quality or anything like that. It's definitely some of the cheapest stuff ever, but considering that the whole package was just $100. I'm very shocked by the crazy amount of accessories, but once you realize the specs of the hardware, things start to make a lot more sense. Now, the system itself is an HP EliteDesk 705G3, and this is rocking an AMD A10 Pro 8770E, and that is paired with a single stick of 8GB of RAM and 128GB SSD. And to really put into perspective just everything that ended up coming out in the package, here is everything laid out. It's a crazy amount of accessories, but as I said, the specs are pretty insane. An A10 is pretty much a pre-Ryzen era CPU, but this is on the AM4 platform. Back in the early days of AM4, AMD actually had released some excavator-based APUs before the Ryzen ones actually ended up hitting the market. So for all intents and purposes, we are dealing with a dinosaur here, and it's a very, very interesting system to say the least. Now, before I actually get into the testing, I did actually end up upgrading the system to 8GB of dual channel RAM instead of just the single stick, since I already had some RAM laying around, and it's just to give the APU in here the best possible chance. And as you can see by looking at the I/O, we actually don't even have an HDMI port, which is why they included the DVI to HDMI adapter. Now, size-wise, it is pretty big in comparison to some of the other mini PCs that I've had, like the B-Link series, but in general it's not very large or anything like that. But I want to jump into some game testing immediately, and we'll jump right into a game that I pretty much test on pretty much anything because it runs on practically anything, or so I thought. Here we have Valorant running on the A10 8770E, and it is the worst performance that I've ever seen in this game with pretty much any system ever. Our 1% lows are abysmally bad, and our averages are not that far behind in terms of just being absolutely disappointing. Really, the experience of trying to play this was an absolute disaster, and you'll see that the GPU is not even being fully utilized here. We are just fully CPU bound. The game really is very demanding on the CPU, and this ancient excavator architecture just is not able to keep up. Overall, this is pretty much just a disaster of an experience, and I've never seen Valorant perform this badly. Now, looking into what the actual system is utilizing, part of the reason that this performs so bad is because the anti-cheat system in this game is very CPU demanding. If Vanguard wasn't as intense as it is, we might actually be able to get at least a decent level of performance, at least in terms of the 1% lows in this game, but that's just not going to be the case with Vanguard running. We are pretty much at 100% CPU utilization the entire time, and anytime anything is actually happening on screen, the performance is abysmal. Now, I had forgot to enable the frame time chart here, so you can't actually see what it's like, but you will actually see the milliseconds, and you'll see that it will just end up spiking up like crazy. And it was really disappointing because I was so confident that this game would actually run on here pretty well that I jumped into an unranked game. And that was a huge mistake because it was so god-awful to play. I felt like I was doing a disservice to my teammates, even though by the end of the game, I actually ended up being second to the top in terms of the amount of kills. But that says more about my teammates than anything else. And after the disastrous showing of Valorant, I decided to jump into Riot's other game, League of Legends, to see if the performance that we can get could be any better. This is usually one of those games that runs on practically anything, and I was kind of just disappointed again by the performance. The 1% lows are really the biggest detriment here, but I'm also just not used to getting a sub 60 FPS average in a game like this. We are with the lowest graphics settings as well. And again, we are extremely CPU bottlenecked. This time around though, we're not reaching 100% utilization on the CPU just because this game only utilizes 1 to 2 cores at most. And on a little quad core like this, that means that we are going to have some cores not actually doing anything. In general though, it's still not great levels of performance, and this really is at this point the worst case scenario for this system because it means it's not going to be able to run practically anything in terms of 3D intensive games. Now, the system itself shipped with a copy of Windows 10, but I decided to install a version of Windows 11 that I've been been seeing a lot of people talk about recently called Tiny 11, which is a very cut down version of Windows 11, pretty much optimized to use the smallest amount of RAM possible and to cut out as much of the crap running in the background as possible to try to give this CPU the best possible outcome. Now, the chip itself was not designed for Windows 11, but this also bypasses all of the different security checks and hardware checks that Windows 11 has. That being said, though, the TPM version is essentially running at 1.2 instead of the 2.0 that's required, specifically required by Vanguard. I had to essentially manually update the TPM chip from 1.2 to 2.0, and at that point I was actually able to play Valorant on here perfectly fine. But as you'll see, the amount of RAM being utilized is just significantly lower than pretty much any other installation of Windows out there. I even went as far as to do some registry edits to make sure that the Windows antivirus was just not running anymore, because just having the executable running in the background when you initially launched Windows was utilizing more than half of the CPU, and I just did not want any opportunity for that to run in the background and ruin the overall experience. And all of this is to say that I pretty much did everything possible to actually give this chip the chance to bring out its performance. As you can see here in League of Legends, we did see a minor improvement in the 1% lows and the averages, and I also do have the frame time chart up now, but in general it was not a monumental change in terms of how it was performing. I really wouldn't say that this was a game changer or anything like that. We're still in the general vicinity of similar performance, though when your FPS is already below 60, anything that will boost your performance is welcome, I guess, but it is not enough to overall change your entire experience with this game. Still, at least it is a welcome improvement. Unfortunately for Valorant, there really wasn't any meaningful uplift to actually make this a fully playable experience. Now, I decided to actually save any potential teammates the trouble of having me on their team, so instead I jumped into deathmatch. That way I'm only ruining the experience for myself. And while we did have an uplift in the 1% lows and the averages, it was again not enough to really change the overall experience of playing the game. So while there are some improvements to be had with these cut down versions of Windows, hardware this old and this underpowered is really just not seeing as big of an uplift to really make a meaningful change in these already really light games. And you might be wondering, what exactly kind of games can you even run on this hardware then? Now, this was all before I installed Tiny 11, as I had already benchmarked some games before actually switching over. But here we have Return to Castle Wolfenstein running with the maximum graphics settings at the full 1080p resolution, and the level of performance that we were getting was actually pretty decent. And I can only imagine that those 1% lows would get a nice uplift with Tiny 11. But with Tiny 11, my main focus was really just trying to get these more modern and popular 3D games to work properly, and this was already giving me a very decent experience. Now, if you're somebody that likes to play indie games, then you're going to be actually able to get some pretty great performance on here. Here we have Dead Cells running on the system itself, and the performance that we're getting is pretty fantastic. You really would not need more hardware than this to play games like this. So if you're an indie head, this is actually really impressive levels of performance, especially for a system that costs $100. Especially considering that most systems in this price range are going to be using older Intel integrated graphics, and those still perform worse than this, though I would imagine that the CPU is going to be noticeably better than this. But in games like this, the CPU isn't really as important. But really, 2D indie games are pretty much as good as it gets here, unless you're looking to also play much older 3D to AAA titles. That being said, I just can't recommend that you buy this, because you can get the HP EliteDesk 705G4, so one generation ahead, for just an extra $50 to $60. And we're talking about orders of magnitude better performance here. I mean, just look at the Cinebench score that we actually get with this A10. We're looking at a multi-score of 901 and a single of 548. The 705G4 with the Ryzen 5 2400G Pro ends up giving us a multi-score of 3,951 with a single core score of 898. So we're talking about significantly higher scores for an extra $60. And just to put both of those scores into perspective, with the Ryzen 5 5600H on the Beelink SCR5 mini PC, we get a multi-core score of 8,002 with a single core score of 1,348. So we're talking about 3x the single core score, and the multi-core score is pretty much more than 8 times higher. here. This is orders of magnitude better performance here. But really, you could see here with the 2400G, the level of performance that we're actually getting in a game like Valorant. And keep in mind that this HP mini PC doesn't even really use the full power of the chip itself, but it's still performing significantly better than the A10. It's not even comparable. This is an actual playable experience where you can get a high refresh rate experience, while the G3 was struggling to even get 1% lows that were above the single digit range. And this was already after upgrading the RAM from just one stick of 8GB to two sticks of 4GB to get the same 8GB amount but with dual channel. Now that didn't really end up being that important since the CPU was just that much of a limiting factor. And I think you're better off just spending the extra $50 to $60 to get yourself this system if you're on that tight of a budget. It really is just going to end up being far better for you. You're still going to be able to play all the same indie games that you could on the A10, but you also get some playable experience in a lot of really popular modern 3D games. And for really no long-term extra cost or anything like that, an extra $50 to $60, if that's really difficult for you to get right now, just save, wait it out. In the long term, you're going to get a system that's going to last you significantly longer because that A10 is already way outdated in the modern era. It actually doesn't even get driver updates anymore. You have to use older legacy drivers to even try to play anything, and when you do, you're not going to get a playable experience in the vast majority of games unless you're playing only 2D indie games or AAA titles from almost 2 decades ago at this point. So yeah, it was definitely the cheapest AMD mini PC that I could find on Amazon, but you sacrifice so much that it's not even worth considering at all. So I'll leave a link down below to the G4 version, and I'll even link down to the B-Link SCR5 mini PC since, as you can see, the CPU is just significantly faster than both of these. And if you have the money for that, then you are going to get a noticeably better experience. But I hope you guys found this video interesting. If you did, be sure to subscribe. I will catch you guys in the next one.